Excellent. So this is the OmniBOR community meeting. It happens every Wednesday at 8 a.m. And let's go ahead and dive into the agenda. So I think everybody here are folks who've been here for a while. So I don't think I have any intros to do today. On upcoming CFPs, we have the CFP tracking spreadsheet. A particular notice I would suggest is OpenSSF Day at OSSEU. If you're going to be there, highly recommend submitting some talks there. KubeCon North America is coming up. Its CFP just closed June 18th. And then we have some ambitions, not so much around a talk, but around being able to have something working for the Rust compiler for the Rust for RustCon. In terms of build tool community outreach, is there anything folks want to update here? I do have a semi-update around Python. Okay, so I've been asked to reach out to Julia to connect Robert with the Python folks. I have reached out. I'm waiting to hear back currently.
That's good.
Yep. Do we have any updates on POCs or questions for implementers?
Just about the name change. I wasn't able to do it.
Yeah, there was a point that was raised by Andrew on the Slack about how we have several different naming patterns for the various projects that we've got in the system. And there was some conversation there. As a general rule, like some of them are that way for reasons. Whether they're good reasons or not is kind of up to the implementers. And so in terms of renaming projects, I think my comment to you, Robert, is I think you already have the permission if you want to rename PyOmnibor to Omnibor-Py.
No, I was going to, but I didn't seem to have it.
Oh, we should definitely figure that out because you should have it. You definitely should have that. So we'll go take a look at that. So I would highly recommend looking at that conversation in Slack to see if it's something you are interested in doing around the tools that you may or may not maintain. But it's basically a maintainer's choice kind of thing. Okay, minimal viable governance item. I think Ava was going to follow up with that. Ava is a conflict this week that precludes them being here. And then there was maybe we need to start talking about the strategic why for OmniBOR. And I think that there was a discussion started by Andrew on that, if I'm remembering correctly. So discussions. How does OmniBOR benefit folks?
I think David started that, didn't he?
I asked the question, Andrew.
Oh, sorry, you're right.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Apologies, I got myself muddled and confused.
Look, it's fine. I mean, you know, a lot of people call me a lot of things. Calling me Andrew is probably one of the nicer ones. And if I'm mixed up with him, it's definitely a compliment.
He is definitely nice. So I would point folks towards the conversation. I don't think we've had a lot that's gone on with that yet. There are several things. I made a bunch of updates that I would like to take a look at, trying to move us towards resolving existing discussions and the road to the initial spec. Do folks mind if we loop back to this discussion either later in this meeting or next week when we've had some time to respond to the discussion?
My bias is to not discuss it this week and wait till at least next week so that there's some text in the discussion thread. Is that okay with you and everybody else?
That sounds good to me if it's okay with everyone else. So I did want to point out as a notable matter that SPDX3 is starting to include things for Omnibor. So they went through and included in their model Gitoids, Omnibor identifiers, those sorts of things, which is goodness. But that's just sort of an FYI. On the, sorry?
I wonder if it would be worth, at some future session, just going over the Omnibor inclusions in SPDX3.
Probably. And in fact, one of the reasons that I would prefer to do that either later in this call or in future sessions is some of what I'm proposing around updating the spec for the input manifest languaging is probably going to be germane to that discussion. Does that make sense?
It does, and I have a question related to that. Would it make sense to reach out to the Cyclone DX people and say, yeah?
It very well could. We've done so in the past, and their response has typically been very dismissive.
I see.
But we could certainly try again. Their response was, "We already do all of this. You don't need to exist." I don't think that's really true. I don't think they quite understood what was going on.
Okay. Yeah.
But certainly would be open to it. Yes. So we had this metadata for Omnibor discussion that was ongoing that I think was mostly settled by the build tool persistence of related metadata pointer. That said, Bharathi had made a suggestion that this would be much easier to understand if there were some examples. And so I did provide some examples. Where effectively what I did here is we had the original text, which was talking about, if you're going to persist metadata, put it in a subdirectory of metadata. You should put it in a context subdirectory of the metadata, where context should be a name uniquely associated with the build tool that you're using. And so here, I simply went through and provided some examples like Omnibor Dura metadata LLVM, Omnibor Dura metadata Clang, Go, RustC, GCC. Do these sorts of examples provide the sort of assistance you were hoping, Bharathi, to make this more understandable for folks?
Yes, I think that helps. So I was just curious after reading this, it's specific to a tool or is it, for example, LLVM, Clang, LLD, every tool is should they have a context name? Like for example, can LLVM encompass both Clang and LLD, or
it absolutely can, right? Okay. What you consider to be the scope is entirely up to you. That's kind of why I listed both of them there. Is you might decide that LLVM is the scope, you might decide that Clang is the scope. It's something you sort of figure out at the tool level.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah.
Also, how about a different version of Clang compiler? They can use their own version specific directory, right? GCC is same for GCC. I assume there will be different GCC version.
Well, I guess the yeah. Okay, sorry.
So basically, there are two ways I suggest looking at that. One is that the build tool should report their selection of a context subdirectory name to the Omnibor spec, just so we can keep a list to preclude collision. That said, what gets defined below that directory is entirely up to the tool. So if the tool wanted to keep, say, an LLVM / version number, and then all the metadata under the version number, that's up to the build tool, right? Because subdirectory structure, file naming, and file schema below OmniBOR metadata context are at the discretion of the build tool for build tool specific metadata or metadata spec for common metadata. Does that start to answer your question, Youngkui?
Yeah,
Youngkui?
sounds good.
Yeah, effectively, your observation is entirely astute, but we're trying not to get in the business of telling build tools the minutia of that, because they're going to have slightly different opinions. And then we also talk here about metadata persisted by multiple build tools in the same way should be documented in specification for that metadata. Such specs must include the context for that metadata. In other words, what subdirectory and meta you're going to put it in. And such specs should be reported to the Omnibor spec for inclusion in a list to preclude context collision. And this is just an off-the-cuff example. Please don't take this example too seriously, and I'd be open for one that's better. If a group of tools decided to store metadata about file locations in a common format, they might choose a context of file location, in which case the metadata would be an OmniBOR metadata file location. Please note, I'm not suggesting that's the right answer for file location. It's just a sort of example. So does this all get clearer? And I do actually, now that I think about it, does that start to capture the observation that you'd made, Barathi?
Yes.
Because you had a legitimate question here.
So my question is, so this is the information about under which directory the metadata information should go in. How is the metadata file itself named? Is that also discussed here, or is it just the same as the artifact input manifest, the same naming convention?
It is discussed in the sense that we say here that subdirectory structure, file naming, and file schema below a particular OmniBOR metadata context are at the discretion of the build tool for build tool specific metadata, or the metadata spec for common metadata. So basically,
I'm just trying to see how we map the artifact input manifest to this metadata.
That is an interesting question that we don't specifically address here. Does that make sense?
I'm just trying to see how otherwise they would, because if the Omnibor ID should find a way into this somewhere, otherwise how will we establish the mapping?
In some fashion. Really quickly, you had a comment or question, Dave?
I'm just, it's kind of a meta question, but are there any other kind of bits of stuff that any of these tools emit as files during their execution? In other words, does Clang or LLD or anything else generate kind of side data or metadata currently? Because I'm thinking that if there are examples of these tools emitting stuff into a build directory, being able to assemble those collections of things might benefit us in two ways. One is if we can find common patterns, let's kind of try to adopt those. And the other one is there might be metadata or kind of textual artifacts, for lack of a better phrase, that are emitted from the build tools that we could also roll into some of the not Gitoid, but other metadata stuff that we're collecting. So does that all make sense? And is it a distraction, or is it a, yes, you're rolling your eyes, it's a distraction, I'll shut up?
Oh, I'm not rolling my eyes at all. It's not necessarily a distraction. I'm just not the right person to answer it. That's probably something better answered by folks closer to various build tools.
So if the tool, say compiler, is going to emit some additional information during the build, that as requested by the user with an option, say if you're compiling foo.c, typically you have the output in foo.some extension that contains that extra information required by that option. So it's that is the typical convention that I have seen. Like even if you're emitting some extra debug information, say during the compilation passes, if you want to understand, then it's typically file name dot suffix that explains the contents of the file. But in this case, since we are all going by IDs, the Omnibor IDs, I felt that the Omnibor ID is a unique way to identify to what artifact it corresponds to, as well as the input manifest, which is also
Yeah, and there to your point that you were asking earlier about like how do you set it up so you can do the correlation. To a certain extent, that's going to be something that has multiple possible answers that will depend somewhat both on the use case of the tool developer for that metadata and also on the taste of the tool developer. So for example, YoungKey has a bunch of things with BombSH where he outputs JSON files that will often have keys of the shape of the artifact identifier or the input manifest identifier. And for the kind of thing that he's doing, that makes a lot of sense. You might imagine a situation where someone wanted to do something similar, but they wanted to encode that identifier into the file name of the metadata information they're outputting so that you could find it, because they may be scattering that metadata across multiple files. That may be more appropriate for other situations. But it sounds like it might be helpful to give some examples without constraining what the build tool authors choose to do. Does that make sense from your comments?
If we don't follow I mean, if every tool has its own way of naming, then the consumer tools will have to parse different, where to go and find them will be different for different tools, unless it's all, it's a standard that is published that, okay, if it's GCC, this is what it is, etc.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
One other thing that's kind of flowing through my brain as this discussion's unfolding is emitting information as log lines. So in addition to storing stuff in files, you also the tools might also emit log lines that could be, with an appropriate tool, reassembled into the generated files. And that might get over the hump or get over the issue of what happens if you don't have a file system to write to. The logs of the compilation tools are also being captured presumably by build systems, and there could be an external tool that also effectively greps for particular patterns that get reassembled into Omnibor receipts. I don't know. Once again, I don't know if I'm distracting or not, and please tell me if I am.
Not distracting, actually. Bringing up an important but slightly off-center topic. because I think it's an important concept, because there are places where that may be the appropriate behavior. For example, for runtimes, that's often going to be the appropriate behavior. For compilers, maybe less so, and there are pluses and minuses to it. It's off center from how do we persist these things to files in the file system, but that doesn't mean it's off center to the broader conversation of how do we output this information.
Okay, thank you.
So it just depends on how tightly you draw the scope. And so I've captured that in the meeting notes. Anything else that folks wanted to talk about on the adding examples to metadata here?
So the examples of metadata itself, like file names or compilation options or the command line options, are they examples of metadata? I think that is also something that needs to be added.
I would tend to think of those as examples of metadata. The thing I would actually request is, Barathi, you and Youngkui and Vajislav have, and all the rest of you who've actually written tools, if you have examples of metadata, could you add those as comments to this pull request so we can loop them in? Because
Sure.
one of the things that I did quickly this morning is I tried looking through the READMEs for examples of metadata. And please note, there's no reasonable expectation that those would be in your READMEs. So don't take this as a call for you to update your READMEs. But I realized that we didn't necessarily have those there. And so that's part of why I made up the not terribly great file location example that I made up, because it was the thing I could do off the top of my head.
Okay, there is still no metadata in the Omnibor repos and the open source repos. So there is in BOR message, yes, there is a metadata that Yonki collects, and I had implemented a private copy just to do some prototyping, but we can add whatever. It also, I think, covers the identifies which is an input file and which is an output file. I think there is another issue that Jeremy had raised requesting for similar information. But yeah, I will go ahead and add whatever information that for the prototyping purposes that we have added in the metadata file, and then we can discuss from there. There could be more information that's useful, but we can start from there.
No, that makes total sense. That makes total sense. Cool. Anything else that folks want to talk about on the Annex A comment stuff? So we do have this more general spec comments in here. A lot of the things in there, not all of them, I think get addressed in this item, which is updates to better reflect input manifest language. So you may recall that Andrew had written a really, really brilliant introduction for the spec. And one of the things that was particularly helpful for that was the introduction of simply calling the input manifest. And one of the things that we noticed in presenting this publicly at Open Source North America was that this radically improved people's ability to understand what we were doing, calling it that. And so I went through and did a pass at updating the rest of the spec beyond the intro to reflect this new language into the document. And I was hoping to get some feedback on that and see how folks felt about it. Do we want to do a linear walk through that here at this time, or are there other things on the agenda that we prefer to jump to instead? Okay, I'm going to take silence to be golden and proceed through the linear walk, if that's cool, folks. So we previously had talked about the Omnibor document persistence by a build tool to its local file system. Wait, sorry, that's Annex A. Let's start with the spec and not with Annex A. So in the spec, there we go. There was a little bit of updating I did in the intro, because it had been talking about if an executable is compiled by linking together object files, the artifact identifier of every object file would be listed in the input manifest for the executable, and the input manifest can be embedded directly into the executable files or provided alongside. The input manifest is not the same thing as the input manifest identifier. And so I did go through in the introduction and shift that slightly by indicating that input manifests can be identified by treating them as artifacts and applying the same identifier heuristic to them applied to any other artifacts. For the purposes of discussion, these are typically called input manifest identifiers or input manifest IDs, or sometimes shortened to IMIDs. And then saying the input manifest identifier can be embedded directly into the executable files, or can be provided in a separate file alongside the artifact whose inputs they describe. Does that feel like an improvement to folks? Does it have glaring things that we should fix? Don't all talk at once.
What does it mean by in a separate file alongside the artifact?
That was simply a carryover from what Andrew had written, where I think he was trying to gesture towards the possibility of a non-embedded mode in the introduction.
Oh, okay, so
and so
that is not discussed here in terms of
yeah,
how.
so I that was simply a matter of me I've been trying to take a principle of least change approach, if that makes sense, particularly when dealing with the extremely well-written introduction that Andrew had written. And so you'll see like the separate file alongside the artifacts whose input they describe, that's both before, both before and after.
I get that, but I was just going back to the original sentence. I was wondering if, because that is a separate topic by itself, which has not been discussed, or there's not much clarity on that. So it's just a possibility of other ways of doing that, right? I think that's what it means.
I certainly added nothing to the spec at this time about how one would do that.
Okay.
So for scope, there's a lot of replacing artifact dependency graphs with input manifests, or rather augmenting, talking about adding input manifests to the list of things we discuss, right? So rather than specifying procedures for constructing and conveying artifact dependency graphs and other related data structures for artifacts, we do it for input manifests, artifact dependency graphs, and other related data structures for artifacts, including but not limited to, and this is a lot of places where input manifest got added alongside ADGs. That makes sense to everyone? Does that read appropriately for the scope?
Yes.
Okay. Apologies, that was just a stray space. For artifacts, I realized, and you'll see when we get further down, that defining derived artifacts and leaf artifacts may be overcomplicating things. When we get further down into describing the input manifest itself, you can provide some feedback as to whether or not the new descriptions are clearer with or without those concepts. I did make some small corrections there, but a comment about using identifiers consistently previously. So I did some in most places replace artifact ID with artifact identifier just for consistency. Artifact dependency graph, this stuff got moved to the end of the document after the input manifests because it makes more sense to talk about them after you talk about input manifests. For build tools, being mindful of some of what can come up with the annex, I did provide some examples. I don't know if that helps, but hopefully it does. And then the bulk of the change here was every place we talk about an Omnibor document, we now talk about an input manifest. And so an input manifest for an artifact enumerates the inputs to the build tool that produced that artifact or the artifact. And a given input manifest utilizes precisely one artifact identifier type, which are sort of some enhancements from the original intro to OmniBOR documents. Then we talk about input manifest identifiers. The input manifest headers is mostly a replacement of artifact OmniBOR document with input manifest.
Spelling, you scroll up a little bit.
Yep.
Input.
Yeah. Yeah, this is terrible. Apologies. Yes, let me fix this. Better?
Yes.
Yeah, that was definitely a typo. Thank you for catching that. I did stop referring to things as child and started referring to them as inputs as well. So the input manifest after the header consists of a list of new line terminated input records rather than child records. And an input record for an artifact for which no input manifest identifier is known is represented as the blob line. So rather than talking about it as a leaf artifact, we just talk about it as an input manifest, an input record for which we don't have an input manifest for the input. And an input record for an artifact for which the input manifest identifier is known is then represented in the longer form. Does that change in phrasing away from talking about leaf and derived artifacts make things harder, easier?
I felt
I'm just kind of curious.
Leaf artifact was more clear in saying that, okay, there's no more extension of that node possible. But was there a specific reason that these are being changed into leaf, the leaf and derived artifacts are being renamed, or was that
my thinking had been to think about it less in terms of a tray and more in terms of inputs.
I see.
But that doesn't mean that we want to sacrifice clarity for that per se. Do folks have other opinions on leaf, this versus using leaf and derived artifacts?
So are we still saying, so the input, this is still the ADG, right? What we used to previously refer to.
So let me
So
actually.
is that mapping still there? Or?
Yes, but let's get down to where I talk about ADGs at the bottom, and we'll take a look and see if that makes sense.
Okay.
Does that sound good? I do stop to note here because I realized it hadn't been noted that this magical space character refers to the ASCII space character because someone might read what we have above here and use the character instead of space. And then I also noted, because this is something Jeremy called out, artifact identifiers and input records should be represented as strings and hexadecimal. For example, blah, because we don't actually talk about how they should be represented. And the input artifact record must be written to the input manifest in lexical order. It's just a switch from OmniBOR document to input manifest. Here, I just use artifact identifier and input manifest identifier, sort of artifact ID and OmniBOR document ID. And they must both be the same type. For input manifest character encoding, it's just switching input manifest for OmniBOR documents. Input manifest identifier embedding. We talked about an output artifact as a new line terminated lexically ordered list of OmniBOR identifiers. And what I realized is this isn't actually what we're talking about doing in the ELF note example. And the key point is to make sure that we have deterministic ordering of the list of input manifest identifiers, which we do in the ELF note spec. We basically say you list them by type based upon the type number as the ordering. So it's deterministic in the ELF spec, but it's not lexically ordered. And so I had fixed that. Does that make sense, particularly for folks who have implemented the ELF stuff? This is again replacing input manifest construction by a build tool for OmniBOR document construction by a build tool. And a little bit of expansion of ID. And again, here we had some remnant use of get object ID, which I replaced with artifact identifier and talking about input manifest instead of OmniBOR documents and input manifest identifiers instead of OmniBOR document identifier. And mentioned that, you know, it has to persist the input manifest using the artifact identifier and input manifest identifier for each type. And I then give some examples because I was mindful of Barothy's previous point on Annex A that we didn't have examples. So I threw together some examples. Do those look reasonable to folks? I didn't want to do something too long.
This is good. Should we also mention how this input manifest itself is named? I think it's probably somewhere else mentioned, somewhere else, like the naming convention of this.
It is mentioned in Annex A, which is how you would persist this to a file system.
Okay.
And
Okay.
and I've got some similar shifts in Annex A. And then we get down to the artifact dependency graph. And the artifact dependency graph is the recursive DAG of all the input artifacts that are transformed by build tools into that artifact. That includes the direct input artifacts and the recursive set of input artifacts all the way down the graph. And then I try and talk a little concretely that it's, you know, the artifact dependency graph in an artifact is the input manifest identifier of the artifact, basically, together with a collection of input manifests that includes the input manifest of the, this needs to be rewritten. It's, I got repetitive where I shouldn't have. The idea is it's a collection of input manifests that contains the input manifests, a set of input manifests such that you've got the input manifest of the artifact and you've got any input manifests that are referenced in the set. So you've got the recursive set of input manifests to form the artifact dependency graph. Does that help with the distinguishing of input manifests from artifact dependency graphs? The input manifest is one set of inputs. The artifact dependency graph is all the input manifests you need to describe all the inputs to the artifact.
Yes, I think that that helps establish the relationship between A and ADG. Just a typo there, ADG in line 330. This the
Yes.
acronym.
Yeah, the acronym is wrong, you're right.
So there's a typo,
It's
right? The ADG, not AGD, on line 330.
Yep. And that's line 330, not 331. There we go. And then I also went and listed out the annexes at the bottom of the document on the theory that that would be helpful to folks. And then in the spec A on the which is the file system persistence, I went and basically did a replacing of OmniBOR document with input manifest. And indicated that it should write its input manifest rather than OmniBOR document. changed the OmniBOR ID to input manifest identifier. So not a lot of contextual change. There had been one comment that ADG was perhaps too generic here from Jeremy, so I worked that in here as well. But other than that, wasn't making any changes to Annex A. In Annex B, again, OmniBOR ID translates to input manifest identifier. Gitoid translated to input manifest identifier. And mostly this is just the terminology shifts to talk about artifact ID instead of Gitoid and input manifest identifier. Actually, this should have been. This was just cleaning up a little bit complaints from markdown linting. The descriptor moved from using Gitoids as raw bytes to artifact identifiers as raw bytes. And Gitoids to artifact identifiers. And then conforming tools must generate all mandatory artifact identifier types. Currently SHA-1 and SHA-256 Gitoids. And that I think was all the changes for Annex B. Do these changes make sense to folks in light of the sort of terminology shift around input manifests? And do folks feel like they help make things clearer?
Yes, I think these changes are helpful.
I don't think it actually changes any of the things you've done in the actual tooling though. We're just talking about them a little bit differently.
Yeah, just one thing I noted is currently where the Omnibor document, or what is the new name for Omnibor document now? It's
Input manifest.
Yeah. So the input manifest, we don't have the prefix of .adg. It's directly written in under objects Gitoid SHA-1. So should that be changed to .omnibor /objects? That is the one thing that comes to me that needs to change in the tool, because Omnibor dir /objects, or is it just an example? Does it have to have?
It is.
Oh.
No, it is simply an example.
Okay,
Omnibor, what I basically need, what this tells me is what we need here is indicate that in this example, Omnibor dir is
set to
.omnibor.
Okay, yes, okay.
Right, because that makes it clear that this is an example. There's nothing magic about the .omnibor. It's just the OmniBOR dir that we're using for the example.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, because I know that's an excellent catch, because we don't get people getting confused about magic strings of that nature. So that's all I had on this item. I really appreciate the feedback. I'll go turn that through, and for next week, come back with improvements that incorporate that feedback. We're down to the last 9 minutes. Are there other things that people wanted to discuss with the remaining time?
I put this in the chat, but if we've got time, how about changing from input manifest to Omnibor input manifest? Yeah, effectively as a qualifier. It also
Okay,
gives.
let me actually.
Go ahead.
I'll add that to the agenda. Yeah, the one thing I will agree with is that the abbreviation IM for input manifest leaves much to be desired. So I will add that in there. Do folks have any thoughts about that at this time? Otherwise, I've captured it so we can discuss it subsequently.
Was it so artifact input manifest different from IM, or was
Oh, there have
understood
been some discussion about artifact as the qualifier. So talking about the artifact input manifest versus the input manifest. And when Andrew wrote it up, he wrote it up just as the input manifest. And I originally had espoused artifact input manifest until I actually tried to go write something. I was trying to do some work to revamp the website. And what I realized is that when I actually was trying to use the term in anger, having the additional artifact qualifier in front of it was not nearly as good as just calling up the input manifest as I was writing. So one
qualified to input manifest would help.
I'm sorry, what?
I think a prefix to input manifest would certainly be useful. I had thought that it was artifact input manifest, so it's the input manifest for an artifact. But it could be, we can discuss it next week as suggested.
Yeah, one thing that I would suggest as a potential exercise if folks have the time for it is try and write a simple paragraph using qualifier of your choice input manifest versus just input manifest, and see how that strikes you, how it feels to you. Because that was the thing that changed my mind on that. And it may not change yours. You may have entirely different tastes than I do. But that was the thing that sort of struck me. Awesome. Anything else before we close this week's meeting?
So I just thinking through David's suggestion of how build tools write additional data, and to also keep things simple. I will add my thoughts to the issue notes, but I was thinking so we emit this input manifest document anyway. Why can't we just add a suffix .md or something to put the metadata in the same place, and the first line in that manifest could have a line to indicate which tool is emitting that, for example, GCC or Clang or LLVM, whatever. So that way we don't have to have different, we know where exactly to go and look for it, and the mapping is also established. So I'll probably add this to the notes so we can discuss it.
Yeah, could you start a discussion?
Yes, I will.
Okay.
Just for the simplicity and how typically tools write additional data. It's a file name with a specific extension that tells that signifies what is the content of that file.
Okay. The one thing I will also comment at this time about is yeah, the idea being kind of similar to what you were talking about with metadata, because we have a similar problem in the not embedded case where we need to stick some kind of a pointer where you could find it, if that makes sense. And that was an idea that I'd sort of been bouncing around in my head, because you may recall that the link farm idea turned out to be massively complicated.
Yes. Yeah, so that way the extensions can indicate, you know, what is going to be in that, what to expect in those files.
Yeah, no, that's definitely worth discussing. And if you could start a discussion at least on the metadata piece, that would be super helpful.
I
wanted to sort of call out the non-embedded piece. I'm sure that you know, folks like Young Key have some thoughts and opinions on that, and will have more as they sort of think about it. But I did want to sort of mention that in passing, since we're talking about propping things in line with file extensions.
Okay. Thanks.
Cool. All right. Thank you all for your time this week. I look forward to seeing you next week.